controversial propositions. They would include that that most risk management processes at the moment are reactive, that they're done generally at too low a level in organisations without proper engagement by leadership of organisations, that they're not built on any sensible forethought or overview of vulnerabilities, and that assumptions about continuity are often fanciful and not built on any logical framework, and finally they often depend on that optimism bias that people have that, well, somebody else will fix the problem and sort it out, and there is thus often no real concept of collaboration, and that we end up operating either at plant level or industry level. I must say that part of my role at Energy Watch in, I guess it was 2005 or so, was to be part of a panel that the Deputy Prime Minister ran with all of the chief executives of the generating companies and I guess National Grid, and that at one meeting there was to be a discussion about a black start event here in London, and they'd been speaking about it for a long time. At the end of those meetings, it was decided to say nothing more about it and not even try, because the overwhelming consensus of the chief executives and others there were that it was just impossibly risky to even try a black start event in London.
Goodness. Okay, so there's it seems too bad, so let's look the other way, right? That's not great. Sally literally is from New Risk Limited, so you're the perfect person to have here. So starting with the kind of high level overview of how you've been thinking about framing risk.
Just diverting for a minute into black starts. This is a very old game. In the Cold War, tremendous attention was being given to black starts, and you would have a very large number of scientists, much more than in this room, working for several days on these issues very carefully, with a lot of calculations of what resources could be used, and there were very good plans for black starts. So some of that work has been done and some is applicable. If we go on to the current subject of catastrophic risk, in my field, catastrophic risk has got nothing to do with probabilities. That's good engineering practice for systems that are not going to fall down. But it's virtually zeros and ones. And nuclear war has, for a while, really been at a 1, in that there have not been processes. There are not, it's open gates, closed gates. There are not processes that I can see at the moment that will stop a war if the mood and mindset of any leadership determines to do a first strike. So that is why I hold that as a 1. So psychologically, the mood and mindset of leaders is extremely important, and one of the flags that you have to watch very carefully if you're going to decide to protect your facilities. That same mood and mindset goes all the way down through the operational systems that you may be running with your people who are maintaining grids and other organisations supporting your industry. In the Australian context, when I worked down the pits, looking at confined space explosions, because unfortunately these were happening in Australia, the mood and mindset and leadership, right from the mine manager down to the crews underground, was extremely important in determining what might happen on any day in a gassy pit. So you have to understand that and start to grasp it. I think your psychology in the way you are looking at this problem is you need to deconflict the massive large events and look at the core issue. Does it matter what hits your infrastructure, you're trying to control it by determining each type of event. My view is that the key is that your infrastructure can keep performing from the highest level of that event and all of the other events that might fall under that. So I think that's very important. In the nuclear side, I'd just like to make a point that psychologically, you're dealing with a totally different element to what you've been used to. And it's different to even a bad Carrington event, because what you're looking at is you're looking at nuclear shock on the population. And if you looked, for example, at an attack coming across the Arctic that might bracket both east and west coast, you might say you had 7 or 8 cities, east to west coast, that had nuclear weapons attacks on them. And that might be one weapon from Russia getting through. That shock is such, well, counterintuitively, it probably will stop the war anyway, because luckily social media now is so good that no population in any part of the world is going to want its leaders to continue such a war. However, that in looking at those types of attacks, you've got psychological shock, you've got water, energy, communications, transport shocks, you've got electronic shocks, and we're talking about loss of communications earlier. And if you look at it, it's the whole command and control system with hemp that you may lose in certain locations. So these shocks need to be considered and understood at a totally different level. And you need to work back at how you're going to operate your islanding, and strategically, should you have national cities survival policy, so that you look at what the types of targeting are and what you may have a random or a very well selected cities that your energy plans will work in with those cities, because those cities may be the core for the US survival long term. And similarly, in a very small country like the United Kingdom, which is small like Israel is small in area, you have to become very, very clever indeed if you are going to have recovery after that type of event.
Excellent, thank you. I want to just stay on the top level of the risk of quantifying it for a moment, and then I think we want to get into the specifics of the events. But I wanted to come back to say, everyone sort of said this in so many words, but the idea of basing things on likelihood is not the best way to go. That what's important is, if we and EIS Council has had this position as well, in that we really focus on these catastrophic black sky events, and that the vulnerability and the consequences are deemed high enough that even though we can't really quantify the event, or we have such a small data set, or it's not very reliable, or whatever it is, or a changing data set in the case of at least climate, but can we at least, do you find that the other two variables that we can quantify pretty well? I know that vulnerability is probably the one that's the most calculable, right? You could do an engineering analysis and say, if you load this bridge by this much weight, it's going to fall down, and if you don't, it's not. Or how much overcurrent can you push through the grid at a transformer or substation at any time? What about the consequences, though, the larger scale modeling? Juliet, do you have a feeling or a confidence level in, can we certainly say if one of these nuclear weapons is used, the consequences will be this, and that we can quantify that pretty well?
So on that specific area, in terms of quantifying the impacts of use of nuclear weapons, I don't think I know.
I guess we should.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm in the presence of experts, so I wouldn't claim to have any knowledge on that. I think one of the points I was going to make, even on the vulnerability, it is a yes and no answer. So some of the things we've talked about this afternoon, in the UK, the Victorian Railways, 170-year-old assets, they have not yet experienced the climate they're about to experience. So we don't actually know how they're going to perform. And again, what we know is from sort of very good asset management practice, looking backwards, how often we need to replace rails, how often, how earthworks degrade over time. But there's the unknown of these very old non-engineered assets already, and then adding to that the unknown of what the climate's doing and how they'll respond to the climate. So again, I think we always have to frame in that, quantify what we do know, but recognize the uncertainties. I guess in terms of consequences, the bigger we get and the more systemic we get, I agree. I think that's the bit that's very hard to quantify. But there are still actions that we can take at a more granular level, where I think we can understand the sort of impact. If we're looking at an individual asset in a railway or an individual asset in electricity transmission, for example, then that's a bit we can quantify, and often there are things that we would do. I'm going to use the privilege of being on the panel and having the mic, because it was interesting what Sally was saying about the catastrophic risk being binary of a 0 and a 1. And I was interested to know which risks you could confidently give a 0 to.
Let's say towards 1 and towards 0.
Okay.
But it's not an additive situation. It really is a case of if you're trying to counter a risk, if you can't show me how you can actually stop certain elements, it's like explosions in a coal mine. If you can't show me how you can stop certain elements contributing to that event, and like the mood and mindset perhaps of Mr. Putin, you can't show a control over that, you're towards 1, and you're not going to be towards 0. And that's very clear. And I think we spend so much time thinking we can control. And I found this in working with nuclear physicists, really all my academic life, though it's not academic. I found that if you're in a nuclear bunker calculating radiation under real war games impacts, my view was that a lot of science would kill people because they tried to be so definitive. And the radiation is not going to stop at that street specifically so that those people can be released from their houses. You have to really become very comfortable with uncertainty to manage these top events.
Excellent. So please on.
Well, I think a thread that needs to be picked up here is that one of collaboration as well. I'm not speaking about a nuclear attack. I have not any way of even conceiving how one would go about dealing with that before the event, but I take it that an important part of this forum is to consider what you would do afterward, and that includes the sort of steps that you can take before that do lead to a greater degree of resilience afterward. And I think that needs a real paradigm shift in leadership. That's why I mentioned early on that I think too often aspects of risk management, or as I like to call it, elements of risk policy, start with that recognition that this is a board level, this is a cabinet level, this is an issue that should be addressed in civil society and academia at a more senior level than it tends to be in normal decision making, and that the common element that I'm referring to that's missing here is institutional collaboration. At that Black Start event I spoke about, every company had their own approach. I know that since then, Ofgem has imposed a strong licence condition on National Grid that tries to harmonise that. But in many other aspects of risks of catastrophic failure of infrastructure, every firm or government agency will take its own approach on that, whereas what's needed is a much more collaborative one where there are routes for consultation. And if I could just take a minor diversion here to say that I think that so many of the things discussed today and in the rest of this conference are things that would be of great interest to colleagues at the OECD, at UNCTAD, at the International Standards Organization, at the ITU, and that I think it would be really useful in coming years for this group to reach out and both inform those other constituencies of your interests, but also to be informed by theirs. That is, to the extent you're not, and I don't know much about you, so it might be that you've done all of that already.
Well, no, we don't have it in the bag yet. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, hey, a couple things, just briefly. There is an ISO standard for EMP signals. It's completely out of date. And I don't think it's terribly useful. Hey, I want to stand up and champion risk, just for the sake of discussion. Yes, it's hard to quantify. Maybe we have lots of 500-year events, but they might just be happening someplace on this big planet where, you know, we would expect maybe a 500-year event almost every day in some respects, someplace for something. But at the end of the day, we do need to have some evaluation of priorities for taking care of society. And risk is at least intended to help us make that decision for prioritization. So if we're just going to throw out the idea of risk, and I'm not saying we should, what are we going to use? How are we going to make priorities for society? So that's my question.
So I want to just respond quickly to say, I was not trying to imply that we throw out risk. What I was trying to imply is that if we start with the traditional approach of trying to figure out the likelihood of an event first, we can make a really bad calculation because we're using the wrong actuarial data set.
We need
yeah.
to be sober about the
correct.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But okay, so how do we make priorities in light of all of this? You know, yes, maybe someday we're going to have a nuclear war. It might be so bad we don't really want to prepare for it. I don't know.
Valerie?
Yes. Can I just give you a different way of looking at it? And that is that if you can deal with nuclear war, nothing else is a problem. And if you look at earthquake risk along the West Coast, for example, West Coast of the United States, if you look at new modern weapons which might put 100 coastlines of your country under a tsunami. Japan has got a triple fault natural earthquake as well, which is the same as the West Coast. The way around it is to look at these catastrophic events and fit the other events under your capability to manage the worst loss of energy, the worst loss of communications, etc. And one of the tricks of getting your mind around this, because we keep psychologically going back to, well, we have to deal with what we can deal with. You can deal with uncertainty by having national strategies and international strategies. Now, a national strategic policy that covered energy resilience, in my view, if it was looking at these worst case nuclear war, you would be using cities. And for energy, cities, if you look at cities as critical infrastructure, whether it is a West Coast US earthquake or not, or whether it's a nuclear attack across some cities, if you have focused your way of looking at recovery of whole cities, and again, the complex systems experts will give a much better iteration of this, but if you can look at your cities in your national infrastructure and look at the range of cities, and you talked about prioritization. So you're not necessarily prioritizing events, but you're getting quite prioritised in your recovery strategy. So if you can manage city regeneration, my view is you've got a lot of these very big problems sorted out. But you can't go into thin air. If we look at hemp, and we're looking at command, control, communications, intelligence, those elements going, which early in the nuclear war they certainly would. You can't just say, well, we've got to have a resilient communication system. You have to look at what do you have to hand, and what are the population and the industry innovatively, what are they going to immediately do? And it's not all new things. You've got to pull out what you've got. It's what you've got in the cupboard behind you that you can use on a very bad day.
Could I just mention too that
I got a question up top, but I wanted to get your responses here before I go to the question.
There's a preemptive dimension to this too, and I'll illustrate that. That in the development, I'm currently working with this organisation on an Australian government and Indian government project seeking to develop ethical frameworks for the implementation of 6G systems. And we're looking at impacts on critical infrastructure, we're looking at competition issues, consumer protection, vulnerability, and a range of things like that for technologies that won't really roll out till 2027 to 2030. But the thinking is that by trying to design in some of these security features, that it's going to be a way of quantitatively reducing likely risks. And that's really just an illustration of a risk policy rather than a risk management approach. It doesn't take away from the risk element, but it looks to push much further upstream the point of intervention, the point of management of that risk. And it happens at the policy level, it happens at the governance level, and it happens at the intervention level. So that security by design and things like that, which are quite possible there, are things that won't ever be measured in terms of outcomes, because the whole intention is to prevent certain outcomes. Pick up on that.
Yeah. So it's maybe a slightly different view of this, and it was just this thought was just triggered by talking about recovery strategy and thinking, and we have at various points during the day mentioned this fact that the most vulnerable people are going to be the most hardest impacted by these extreme events. So some of those pre-event measures, which are not necessarily going to be about the hardening and the strengthening of the systems, but actually providing those vulnerable people with the equity, the access. I mentioned, for those of you who were here first thing, the work we were doing in Peru. So the provision of that infrastructure, which is schools and healthcare, is not simply for those buildings to be resilient. It's because from that, communities have healthcare, they have education, and they are in a better position to sort of trigger that community response that we've talked about. So I think that some of these measures, which are not necessarily, they might feel indirectly responding to some of these risks or catastrophic events, but until we have social equity, we're always going to have this sort of two tiers of society. I think with my electric car and my teenagers with their mobile phones and their tablets and their Netflix, to some extent you could say I'm going to be quite heavily impacted if the power goes off, but actually I'm not, compared to those many people in the world who, they might be living without power most of the time, but they're much more vulnerable and much less able to cope, really.
Yes, thank you. It's important to pay attention to the fact that any of these things happen, it's the vulnerable communities that are going to suffer the worst consequences. Sir, thanks for your patience. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Paul Martin, I'm former head of CPNI, so background in national security. Fascinating conversation. I just wanted to offer a couple of thoughts really about risk. I completely agree. Risk is the core concept. We absolutely have to hang on to it. But I'd say there's good ways and bad ways of thinking about risk. And there's quite a lot of bad stuff out there, quite a lot of sort of pseudoscience. I think first it's important to recognise that some of these risks emanate from natural events, and in some cases, some of them are fairly stable over time. Other risks emanate from intelligent threat actors. So if you're thinking of national security risks, things like high-end terrorism or hostile state activity, it's an adaptive risk. So you're dealing with threat actors who are watching what you're doing. So the moment you defend yourself, they're finding a way around it. So it is not a static risk game, it's an adaptive game. And I would say it is pointless trying to sort of quantify how the future will play out, because the moment you know what they're doing, you change the system. You're locked into a kind of arms race. It's a very different kind of risk. If you're then looking at the really interesting risks, which are the low likelihood, although if you wait long enough, they're high likelihood, low likelihood, very high impact risks. Most of the really interesting ones have had a frequency so far of 0 because they've been stopped or nobody's had the capability to do them. And those that have happened, they've happened very infrequently, and each one has unique features. So risk is a crucial concept, but where it goes wrong is the misapplication of quantitative risk metrics that were invented for other purposes, like dealing with insurance risks or certain kinds of financial risk or health risks. They don't work in this context. And actually the way around it that evolved a long time ago in national security is to think in terms of relative risks. It is impossible and futile, I think, to try and quantify most of the interesting national security risks. What you can say with reasonable confidence, using structured professional judgments based on everything you know, which is obviously incomplete, is that this particular type of risk is more likely to materialize than that risk, or this particular type of risk would have a higher impact than that kind of risk. Finally, strategic point, so it's absolutely right. I think there's a good model that works quite well, the UK National Counter-Terrorism Strategy Contest. I think conceptually it's rather clever and it stood the test of time. It looks at the causal chain leading to something really bad happening, an attack that kills lots of people, and it tries to tackle that risk at every stage in the causal chain. You try and understand and deal with the underlying causes. Why do people want to do it? You tackle that. You pursue the threat actors, security, intelligence, policing, all of that sort of stuff. You find out who they are, where they are, what they're trying to do. You disrupt them. You identify the targets you really care about. You harden them, you protect them. Protective security, you reduce their vulnerability. And finally, recognizing that you can't guarantee that any of that will work, you prepare to deal with the consequences, disaster recovery, incident management. I would say that crisis management, incident management, disaster recovery is the last thing you do. It shouldn't be the first thing you do. You try and stop it happening. So risk is important, but it's important that people don't get trapped by this sort of tyranny of quantification.
Thanks. I want to let Sally, I thought I noticed you champing at the bit here.
Yes, I totally, obviously, we've got total agreement on that. I wanted to bring back a point so that you don't leave this conference without understanding. We talk about vulnerable people. It's them, not us. But in the disaster recovery units that I've worked in and in doing post-traumatic stress recovery, psychological work with victims, what I've found is the victims are very often the very high-performing, highly capable people who found because of the massive disaster, they cannot perform. And this goes back to people who are running IT units, doing data management, who are critical to their operations. It's equally heads of welfare services who may be vulnerable. And equally in understanding vulnerabilities of people, I can remember talking to the senior military Russian commander after Chernobyl, and I talked to him about the problems that he had with evacuation. And it, of course, the most vulnerable were the elderly, and they weren't going to leave their animals. And so they have stayed, and they actually have continued to stay. And the same thing happened with Fukushima. So the people who you feel are very vulnerable are often going to show exceptional strength, but you have to work around some of those problems.
Yes, another element that was discussed earlier in the day were people musing on finding sources of investment in building resilience, and that conceptually, I think we should change our thinking there to one not so much about the cost of building in resilience, but a conversation about the avoided cost of failure. And that as one looks through, I think I saw an estimate, again, it might have been from National Grid, about the cost of a catastrophic energy event in the UK. And I think it was something like a $2.8 trillion bill for seven days of the system being offline. And for COVID, the UN has a calculation, I think it's pretty rubbery, but that it looked at something like a $12 trillion loss to the global economic welfare, and that it doesn't take much conceptually there to see how such a tiny fraction of those losses may have mitigated them in the first place, and that at much smaller scale those things operate all the time. I think of things like the Texas transmission failures this year or last year, and I understand there was a similar one 10 years ago, the Auckland transmission line failure where they didn't think it was important to have more than a single transmission line into the city, and even things like the Ford Pinto, where they thought it was a good idea to have the fuel tank right behind the back bumper bar. All of these things were ones where simple investigation of some of those vulnerabilities and probabilities would tell you that a dollar spent on mitigation upfront through higher level planning would save many times that afterwards. And we see that so often in Australia with a big dam failure a couple of years ago, and other things like that, where you just see serially that the risk management policy that were implemented were at too much of a retail level when they should have been more at a wholesale level.
Thank you, Alan. Greg, I saw that you had a question, but I need to wrap up here, and I know you're on the next panel, so. I
remember.
Oh, okay, sorry. So that leaves me to you, Juliet, if final word on this
I get
question.
the closing comment.
You get it.
Thank you. And I did have one, but then as you mentioned the word wrapping up, my brain went, I'm probably not going to even try and recover it because it won't be very.
Can I help?
There you go, Washington can help you out. Thank you.
Just bail you out. I mean, I've just got the one question, which is on policy. Our policies, are they fit for purpose? And if they are not, what do we do about it? So as a wrapping up kind of comment, are they fit for purpose? Policies, or not? What can we as a conference, as a collective, do about them?
I suggest you read the R2P risk management policy monograph.
Is there a solution there?
A way of thinking.
I think you're setting your sights too low in relation to energy. If you're really wanting to go strongly into policy and strategy, you have to aim for the G20 and for NATO. Picking up what I said before, psychologically at the moment around the world, it's the right theme to go into. And I think anything less than G20 is not going to get grabbed by the world.
I have got one now. Thank you. I had a breathing space. So I think similar to a lot of the discussions during the day, there's never going to be one single policy that's going to solve these problems. And it's a question of looking at the sort of jigsaw puzzle and understanding changes that can be made that will contribute towards increased resilience, and maybe again not getting too hung up on the single silver bullet policy that we're all, that we're 100% certain is the one we're looking for. There's always something that can be done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'd like to thank the panel. Thank you, Julie. Thank you. Thoughtful question. Panel of the day, panel chairman Terry Boston is approaching. Also on the panel, Sir David Higgins, Yoshi Schneck, Scott Blevins, and Greg Autry.
As the panel is coming down, I'll get us started a little bit. 49 years ago, and I was talking to Sally about it at lunch, I moved into an underground bunker that was designed for anything other than a direct nuclear attack, and we were 5th on the Soviet Union's target list. Now, the issue there is not much has changed in the last 49 years as we look at the risks that we're facing. As a matter of fact, after heading the storm center at TVA in the southeast part of Tennessee and Hurricane Alley, also Tornado Alley, I thought I'd seen everything, so I moved to the Mid-Atlantic just in time for Superstorm Sandy and the kind of polar vortex where we went to a minus 24 degrees. And back to our comment about measurements, you can't test a minus 24 degrees with the model. You have to have a minus 24 degrees. Given I'd had the power off in several states in my career, the president selected me to be an advisor to the National Infrastructure Advisory Council. And I have advised 3 presidents on grid security and that sort of stuff. And basically speaking, I've had that call, there's a bomb in the substation, what are you going to do about it? I've had that call, my power is off and I'm on life support, what are you going to do about it? But I have seen no one work harder than Avi Shura in this group. And I've got a question for the audience. If there's going to be a global resilience team, who's going to be on it if it's not me and you under the leadership of Avi Shura? Let's give Avi a hand for that. And this panel is about, and we lost Matt. Matt, you're supposed to be on this panel. Come on down. Oh, okay. I did not, Chris did not tell the panel chair that. So, and I had questions for you. I'll still ask them. But let me say, climate change is here. It's real. It's coming. The comments that we had about the history is not an indicator of the future is very real. I didn't know what a derecho was until I had to manage one. It was tornado force winds, 200 miles wide, 500 miles long, from Chicago to Washington, D.C. So we're seeing more events across the system. And we put together a panel today, not to talk about what we're going to do, but what we have done here and now and what the results might be. If we don't have a robust, resilient, reliable grid, and I put more emphasis on reliable because I can tell you from experience, if the power is not on, nothing else we do matters, really, if you think about it. But the resiliency is simply what I define from a Timex commercial of my youth. How do you take a licking and keep on ticking? How do you ride through Superstorm Sandy with 142 elements out? So with that, let me look down the line and we'll start right here with Scott. Scott, tell us a little bit about your background and where we're headed communication-wise.
Yeah, my name is Scott Blevins. I spent 30 years in the Kentucky Army National Guard, worked full-time for them for about 20 years. They gave me experience on the military side of looking at I've always been in communications. So that gave me the experience on the military side of all the different military tactical communications and capabilities. Working full-time for the National Guard, worked very close with the emergency management, which introduced me to all of the emergency communications on the civilian side, as well as just your standard, regular, everyday communication systems, your typical internet kind of things, router switches, servers, that kind of stuff. So that was my background. I retired from the National Guard, and then I started working for the EIS Council. I'm their technical director for communication systems. So that's what I look for in these type of events is how can we continue to communicate in these kind of disasters? You want me to go on to the other stuff?
Yeah, I'm David Higgins. I'm an engineer. I've worked half my life in the UK and half my life in Australia and Africa. And I've been in major construction, mainly infrastructure and property development, banking, investment. Been CEO of 5 different companies. I work for 6 companies at the moment. I chair 2 boards of listed companies, and then I advise private equity on the London School of Economics. I chair their finance and the States Committee.
So I already talked about myself a little bit today, but as I said, I worked most of my life in Israel Electric Corporation. My last job was Senior Vice President for Information Communication and the Chief Cyber Officer of the company. After I retired, I saw that I will rest a little bit, but I worked much harder than before. So I'm partially working with ACE as Electricity and Security Coordinator, and I have my own business too, and I'm working still in Israel Electric Corporation.
I've already gotten to introduce myself, so I'm going to use my time real quick to tell another storm story. So I come from Southern California, and if you don't know, I don't know whether the news made it here to England. We had a really bad winter, quite unexpected. And I have a home in the mountains outside of Los Angeles, and I was snowed out of my home for 3 weeks. It wasn't possible to get into it, and that's not something that we're used to, right? And everybody seems to think and kind of imply, well, you know, if the government doesn't come rescue you, you're doomed. And in this case, the governor declared a state of emergency and seized all the snow plowing ability that existed, including the National Guard and the commercial companies in order to plow the state and county roads. My home was in a private community where the roads were all private, and normally we would reach out to private contractors to plow the few inches of snow that might end up on our roads, but we couldn't because the state had all the access. So people were stuck in there. My friends were stuck in there for weeks. A lady gave birth by herself because she couldn't get out and nobody could get to her. And everybody was like shocked. Is that even possible? And, you know, it's pretty funny when we reach the point where we don't think we can perform a basic biological function without the government coming to rescue us. But yeah, it turns out it is possible. And people are resilient. I do want to say that. And I don't want to say we don't need to help them, we don't need to plan, but sometimes I think we underestimate how resilient human beings can be.
To add to that war story, on Thursday of last week, the airport in southern Florida had 7 months of rain in 7 hours. And it was underwater, David. So it says what we're used to in the rearview mirror in terms of climate weather risk is not what we're going to see in the future. But Joe McClellan brought up something that we've talked about a lot at the National Infrastructure Advisory Council to the President of the U.S., and that's quantum computing. And I want to have the first question to Yossi. And by the way, the former CIO became CEO of Southern Company. He said CIO stands for career is over. So if you look at today's threats that we have in terms of cyber and even physical threats to the communication control infrastructure, Yossi has seen it all, and I'm very proud of the work that they've done in Israel.
So like everything, it has pros and cons. Like everything, quantum computers, pros and cons. And so let me take you a little bit about the pros. You know, actually, we are getting some much more horsepower computing, much more horsepower for computing, and it solves a lot of problems. Just an example, we have used once for our long-term planning of electricity market in Israel, and software called WASP. It was developed by EPRI, and single run took about 3 weeks of computer. If the computer didn't fall or collapse during those 4 weeks. So actually it was terrible. Those simulations that we have done, we actually eliminated different very important parameters just to make it work. So today, computers and quantum computing will bring us to new reality. We actually talk about AI. So the ability of AI is going to increase much more because of the additional power we are getting. And I always say, you know, when we are talking about transformation of data, so we succeeded very well to take data and to transform it to information, and from information to knowledge. But then suddenly we stopped and we didn't make the next step. So in the last year or 2 years, we are actually making the next step, and the next transformation actually wisdom, to create from the knowledge wisdom. And the new computer power that is brought by quantum computing, we actually enable to create more and more wisdom from what we are known. I heard today some discussion about AI. Yeah, there is a risk of AI if it is misused. And I even heard that somebody asked, maybe we should stop it or something like this. So my opinion is very simple. First of all, you cannot stop it. AI it's like a virus. It will spread and it will enter to a lot of additional processes. We have made, I'm working with some research group. We made some estimation what it will take to stop AI, to stop the process. And we have a very interesting insight. It's like a loop process. We decided at the end of the day, or we got the insight at the end of the day, that to stop AI, you need AI. Okay, so actually this is the solution. Now about the cons. You know, the main challenge that and everything everybody is concerned is actually about the encryption process, or encryption and hashing process. Those are two processes that are actually based on mathematical solutions, and because of the ability to produce much more computer power, actually those algorithms are breakable. So it's a concern, but from my point of view, it's something that is solvable. It will take actually some effort to replace different algorithms that we are using today, even though not all the algorithms will be replaced. There are some algorithms, those that are familiar a little bit with encryption. We are using plus minus 5 or 6 different algorithms today. 2 of them will still remain. They will be modified a little bit. Remains. The other one should be replaced. But at the end of the day, the solution is already here. I'm sure you are familiar. There is a new standard by NIST for encryption. It's called Crystal Kyber. That is actually a mathematical algorithm that is suitable for encryption in supercomputers and in quantum computing environments.
My next question is for Greg, and I thought I had seen everything, having headed the Storm Center for 20 years, and then 2 things happened. Chris took me to DARPA to talk about EMP threats, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow. But and Joe McClellan talked about the Carringer event of 1854, I think, and we had been measuring the induced currents on the neutral transformers for some time, but we've never had that kind of event. So what do we do now with the early warning? And I've tripped off 3,000 megawatts in less than 15 minutes. I'm sure a 15-minute warning from an L1 satellite that we heard about earlier has value to it. So tell us a little bit more about the solar risks that we have.
Sure. So we don't even know that, the Carrington event is a maximum event in any way, but we believe it was the largest one in the most recent 500 years. the satellite at L1 will see the stuff coming in. A satellite at L4 or L5 off to the side, these are stable points between the Earth and Sun's orbit, can give us an idea of the magnitude. So we can get both the accuracy of direction and magnitude, but again, with that 15, 20-minute warning. Before that, we can observe the sunspots and we can see the flare occur, which might give us 1 or 2 days. The Carrington event, though, appears to only be, I think, 17.6 hours between when Carrington himself saw the flare and was nearly blinded in his telescope and when it hit, and all of a sudden telegraph operators were being electrocuted. So not a lot of time. I don't know what you do there. Now, I'm most interested in what we do with space assets. If we have mobility, there might be some ability to make sure that the things we really love are on the other side of the Earth during the most critical point when it hits, or that things are inside the Van Allen radiation belts where they have a little more protection. But in most cases, there's not much we can do except try to harden them. Now, like the GPS satellites, they're already hardened as good as they can because they're operating outside the Van Allen belts in a high radiation environment to begin with. But I think we just assume we lose them. So now we got to get to replacement. That's going to be hard to do in a society where your grid is down and we don't know how much damage is going on the ground. We're trying to do some space launches. We've got to have dedicated responsive launch sitting on the pad waiting to go there. And I mentioned Virgin Orbit as an example previously. Now their system needs to be able to launch something bigger in order to do that. But a system like that, a system like a company called ABL, who's making a road launch rocket that basically fits in a container, is another option for this. But we've got to have multiple systems ready to go that can do this. And to do that, the government's going to have to believe this is a big enough problem to just basically pay a retainer to keep this stuff on tap, because if it's not ready to go, it takes days at best and weeks more likely to get something like this ready to go. So we're nowhere near there. We don't have a whole constellation of GPS satellites to replace the ones that are up there. Launching just one is a big event. So we're nowhere near where we need to be on the space asset side. The warnings, we could probably do a little bit better with the science, and AI may play a positive role in our ability to understand how the sun is behaving and what the cycles mean as we collect a lot more data.
Let me add that we have moved to synchrophasor measurements for the power system as a backup to SCADA and EMS, and they are very dependent on the GPS satellite links that we have. So the loss of GPS, as was discussed in the earlier panel, is serious business. David, let me turn to you, and this is one I just mentioned. Fort Lauderdale had so much rain that the airport looked like a lake. Los Angeles has moved to all electric mules to move the planes around. What are we doing in our airport so we can move food, if nothing else, after a major blackout?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Kansai Airport continues to sink. And I don't know whether you saw it a few years ago. It had a meter of water over the runway, which is a major runway for Japan. It's just slowly sinking into the bay, and so that's a result of its geography. But it also means that airport resilience has got to be dealing with extreme climate events more. I'm always mesmerized by the way that you can fly out of Chicago when it's heavily snowing, and they have the de-icers sitting on the end of the runway as well as at the terminal, and yet here we have half an inch and the whole place grinds to a halt. So what does it do? I mean, what COVID showed us is that a massive amount of material for countries to survive on goes in the belly of passenger planes. And no one really realized how much that really was. And that kept some major airlines like Qatar and that, and obviously get some subsidy of that, but it was crucial for those companies to survive in terms of that. But you're right about the snow and the climate events. I think it's a broader issue in terms of climate events and planning for that, because one thing we are pretty damn certain of, who knows what causes it, we are phasing into a drier planet and we're phasing into more extreme weather. And I think there's only one answer, which is to build now to plan for that. And that's everything from the wildfires in California to, I was in Sydney when we had we had fires that destroyed an area around Sydney the size of Wales. It killed 1 billion native animals in that one fire that went for 2 months, and it only stopped because of change in wind. It would have otherwise kept burning forever. So I think we've got a plan for that in flood resistance, in networks. The various continents are drying out, and the consequence of that will be large movements in people. And we need to plan for that. We need to think of all of our major infrastructure assets to cope with extreme climate events, whether it be airports with major snowstorms or whether it be water systems that can't possibly cope with the dry periods we're going to focus on.
Let me move now to communication, and this is where I was going to pick on Matt had he chosen to be here. Matt built a 500 kV substation on Mount Storm, West Virginia. Why would anybody put a substation on a mountain named Storm? I don't know. But during the hurricane season that we had, Superstorm Sandy, we had 142 elements out, and the biggest problem we ran into was the satellite telephone systems that we were using became overly loaded. I was in a meeting with Chris, and the first question I said, do we have those satellite phones kind of in EMP shielded bags? And the answer was no, we don't. So communications during a severe event. So fortunately, EIS under Scott's leadership has done some things that is ready here and now, not in the hereafter, for communication. So tell us something about what you have accomplished at EIS. And we tested at PJM and at Dominion.
Yeah, so the concept that we've been working on within the EIS Council is called the BSX Communication System, Black Sky Communications and Coordination System. One of the components of it that we have relied on as we've looked around for different technology in order to bring into the BSX system is the BNet radio that Rafael manufactures. That's the radio when you all walked out there for like coffee breaks and everything. You see those green radios sitting over there. They brought a couple different models, their vehicular model, handheld model, and their new BNet Nano. Why we looked at that particular radio was, first of all, it's EMP hardened. So everything we've been talking about here is EMP. One of the things about when we talk about surviving nuclear blast and nuclear events and everything we've been talking about here, you know, the internet was designed for that exact purpose, with the whole protocol being internet protocol or IP based. And, you know, so it can perform internet over protocol type capabilities. I can go on and on ad nauseum about how it can form mesh networks and all kinds of other things. One of the other key things that it can do, and one of the reasons why we selected that technology, is any event of a major catastrophe type event, you're going to have a lot of communication systems that goes down. When we look at wireless communication systems, we need radio frequencies to talk. And a lot of people have this concept, well, it's the Wild West. I'll just use whatever frequencies I want, right? I'll just turn to different frequencies if the radios and stuff can tune to those. But then that creates a problem because now everybody's stepping on each other and they're destroying each other's signal. So one of the things that it can do that we looked at is what's called spectrum harvesting. It can look out there, see what frequencies aren't being used, and then pull those frequencies in to build bigger data pipes. So now I can push voice, video, data, et cetera, across these pipes without creating the interference. We've talked a lot about policy. And one of the issues that we've been running into, like when we went to the FCC, to the Federal Communications Commission there in the United States, to look at how could we leverage this thing in a disaster, they just weren't prepared for that, right? Because policy lags technology. And so that's one of the issues that we've been looking at is how do we get the policy to adopt this new technology that can allow us to leverage something like this in a catastrophe. Quickly talked about some of the stuff we did with Dominion and PJM. Well, one of the radios out there we actually took and we did get it FCC certified, but only to operate for what they call land mobile radio communications. That's just your basic walkie-talkie type things that you think about police, fire, EMS. Power companies use them to communicate with their crews and stuff. So we did do that, so that way they have an EMP protected radio there that they can use with their communication systems. with the goal of eventually getting to this point where we get the waiver and we can actually bring on those other features in the future. And then the second thing we did was where we worked with them on what we discovered when we were doing all this stuff is that there was a lot of power companies out there that have a thing called dark fiber, where they put these ground wires on their high transmission systems, and then the side of the core of it is fiber optic cable. And a lot of that fiber optic cable is not being used. And the fiber optic cable obviously is not going to carry the EMP power and stuff down through it and destroy the system. So if you just EMP harden just those routers at those junction points, you can start to build an EMP connected network. So one of the other things that we've done here recently is we did tie in Dominion, PGM, and Exelon so that we could create a fiber optic communications network that was separate from it. That was EMP hardened. So that was just some of the things that we've been working on.
And I would add a lot of the repeater stations are in metal boxes under transmission towers that are EMP hardened unto themselves, even though they weren't designed to be EMP hardened. By the fact that they're in Faraday cages already makes it much easier. Obviously, you have to test them to make sure that you haven't punched holes. We haven't talked a lot about EMP, and my hat's off to Trent Franks on when he was in Congress, we could mention EMP and people would know what we're talking about. It now it's a four-letter word. I don't know. It's very hard to get an audience with policymakers. And we had Senator Johnson came to the Washington, D.C. meeting and was very positive on how we might be able to do something. But on the EMP hardening, not only do we have the communications, we have the controls, and those controls being relays. And just using a wild guess, there's probably close to 3 million digital relays out there, Matt. And at best, they lose their minds. They lose the setting. At worst, you destroy the electronics in it. So could you share from the floor any experience that Dominion has had? And I'll walk you the phone. And I apologize, you were supposed to be on my panel anyways. Tell us about hard.
Yeah, so as far as relays go, one of the things that we look to do is try to make sure that, our new design standards actually place layers of protection around the relays themselves. But sometimes, and what I mean by that is actually moving to standards where you get some intrinsic benefit from the type of construction you use within the control enclosure that the relays sit within. And then a lot of that plays into how that control enclosure is grounded, the materials that are used in that control enclosure. Obviously, we're now preferring metal control enclosures, but then we're even starting to look at things like the entrances, the cable entrances to those control enclosures, how they're bonded not only within the control enclosure itself, but on the individual relay panel. So that's one way to do it, and that's one way to harden your control system, is to place your relays within an environment that is intrinsically protected. But the belts and suspenders associated with that is something that we're also pursuing within Dominion Energy Virginia, and that's the development of what we're calling a relay depot, which is an EMP hardened facility just for the purpose of storing critical spare equipment for our black start paths and other critical infrastructure, not only relays but communications equipment and server equipment as well.
You sure may. Matt?
Terry or
on EMP. So, I'm very impressed with all of this work to kind of harden systems against EMP, and I guess we're talking about E1. I'm not really sure. Yeah, I guess I just have to wonder, something is just going to leak in somewhere. You can try to harden it here. You think you've hardened it everywhere, and oh yeah, there's that other thing that you forgot to do, and EMP just being, because of its blanketing nature of the signal, it's going to find the weakness and it's just going to go in and zap you. And so I have to wonder, is it worth it to really harden, given that maybe you're not going to be able to catch everything? So
just a quick response to that. I think the way you have to look at it is layers of Swiss cheese, right? Is there going to be the hole that gets through all the various layers of Swiss cheese? And yeah, there could be here and there. And that's why we want to make sure that as one of the layers of protection, we actually have that Faraday cage relay depot that is actually a purpose-built EMP enclosure to store a critical mass of devices.
as spare parts.
As spare parts.
Let me add, you also use meters. You measure it. You look at the radio frequencies and that you can use that don't destroy equipment, and you find those holes and then you plug them, if you will. And my alma mater, I will add, TVA, has come up with a Faraday filings, iron filings in concrete that makes a lower cost Faraday shield for a control system. You got to have radiological shielding already, so you put into the concrete the ability to be that Faraday cage, which is a little lower cost than what Matt did with a Faraday shield inside the building. But we know how to do this. 1962, we knew it was a serious problem. 1952, we knew it was a problem. We've kind of sat back and fell asleep saying nobody would waste a weapon, a nuclear weapon, on explosion in space, but the loss of life potential there is probably much greater than hitting a major population center. Questions from the audience?
Where's the closest bar? No, I think everyone is a bit tired. That's it.
One here too.
Going to that, and then I'm going to. Miss
I,
anyone?
I've got another one.
Go ahead, Terry.
For the group. We talked about the GPS satellites and how important they are. The Bureau of Standards used to have a nuclear clock that we could time synchronize things with, like the power grid. What's our backup plan? You mentioned we don't have satellites that we could replace the GPS network with, but for time synchronization and time positioning, and more seriously, any wartime efforts we have is very dependent on time synchronization. So with that, let me hand it down.
Yeah, good question. And if all you want is timing and you don't need the position and navigation, then yeah, you could put a series of radio antennas. There used to be, you'd get your signal from the Colorado radio broadcast from their atomic clock, but you could put those all over whatever country you wanted and fiber optically connect them with a rad-hardened network. And you'd want to make sure there were no holes in the Swiss cheese, but that is not that undoable. I mean, that is doable. Then you got to get all these factories, though, and financial institutions that now have hardware in place that talks to GPS to start talking to these things. That's a big investment in the private sector, getting them to step up and do that.
To answer the GPS question, the military has been dealing with GPS denied areas for many years. Issue for everywhere in the world where military operations go, and there are solutions how to deal with that. But BNet, as Scott described, also has time synchronization, and that network time processors basically means they can synchronize one another and synchronize other devices. There are many solutions as long as the connection. Yeah. Go into the technical stuff, but not at this hour. So there are solutions.
Private sector, that's expensive to get those sort of connections you have between your devices.
Yes.
And there are other solutions of how to do this on a wide scale manner, because at the end of the time, also when we talk about the EMP that you're talking about, also when we come from the military side, if you have a tank or an airplane, they're protected for EMP from their design up. And what Matt's describing, if you build the building from the bottom up,
you know how to design it to be EMP hardened, and then you have solutions how to do this. There are several sectors in the industry that have this as a way of life, both GPS, both EMP, both hardened and survivability as part of their way of life.
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, so the question is for Matt. So Matt, on the, you've got your relay depot, you got your protections, your Faraday cages around your control buildings, your substations. Have you hardened the relays themselves? Have you been able to make any progress on that? What about the chips on the relays? Have you been able to do trusted foundry, anything in production in the United States or allied countries?
There's been, and I'm sure you know about this, Joe, as well, but for the group, you know, there's been some industry action that's been really productive in this space. A lot of the EPRI initiatives have helped us come to an understanding of exactly what the relays can withstand, where their weak points are, and where we have identified weak points. You know, what kind of shielding can we use on the control cable? What type of, surge protective devices can we pair with the relays to mitigate any areas that are concerning? So I would say that's a work in progress. Again, mitigations are like Swiss cheese. Every mitigation has a hole in it. And the thought is that, how many layers do you need? You don't want so many that you're excessive and you go beyond what's prudent, but you want to make sure that you at least do what's prudent and reasonable. So I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but work in progress.
Helpful too. Yeah. And I think maybe compare notes afterwards, because also multiple attacks. So just as you start your recovery, you've got your spares, you're pulling your spares out. That's when an adversarial action is also likely, right?
Exactly. And, I'm glad you brought that up, because when we were looking at the design of the relay depot, at first I was thinking, because nobody had ever built one of these before. And at first I was thinking, okay, well, we don't need a backup generator. What we'll do is we'll store a generator in the depot and we'll roll it outside and we'll plug the depot in, and then, we'll have the power we need. Well, that's exactly when the second attack is. So then we had to start thinking, well, gosh, what do we do with the depot in terms of backup generation that within the Faraday cage? You have to think that way. You have to think 1, 2, maybe 3, 4 punch down the line.
It's an excellent answer. And then I guess the same question for Yossi then. What has Israel done? I mean, we've seen public reports like, failures, Mr. Launch failures, which actually look more like trajectories for EMP strikes. So they've been in the public source media for Iran, North Korea. So is Israel looking at this for critical infrastructure? What have you done to harden your relays and controls in your facilities?
Actually, we have done a lot of work in IEC around protecting our infrastructure against EMP, including our electronic rooms, including our relays, including different things. But as Matt said, you cannot actually cover everything. So we prioritize those places where actually you provide, I would say, best security or EMP security that is critical for the system. So it's not covered, but we invested a lot of it, EMP, and also physical problems that we are facing in our substation, including this protection that actually includes physical and EMP protection together. Earthquakes, also earthquakes protection and different things. So a lot of us was invested. And Joe, if you allow me, going to what Matt said about the second wave of attack. So one of the things that or concern with AI, misuse as AI, is actually creating a wave of continuous attacks and second wave, third wave using AI technologies. And this is one of the things that we are concerned and dealing with in current days.
Without compromising any sort of national security positions, Matt and Yossi, have you been able to compare notes, exchange information, benchmark against each other?
Yeah, we've actually a couple of Israeli Electric come to our facilities, and I believe one of my former colleagues at Dominion Energy has been over.
So exchanging information.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just change the direction a little bit. So I'm actually thinking about emerging economies and how they might deal with these kind of threats, given that they've got much less infrastructure generally. So I'll just repeat it. Yeah, my question is about emerging economies and how they might deal with these kind of threats, and particularly, is there a lot of sharing going on between more developed economies and the kind of research that we're talking about here and those emerging countries?
Well, I mean, having worked in South Africa years ago, we all know the problem with power in South Africa. Now you live in a what is really a well-developed country, but you have to allow 6-hour blackouts most days, and industries that have had to plan around that now. And that's the complete destruction of Eskom, which is a state-owned and what was a fantastically established power company many, many years ago, but now it's completely destroyed.
I think to some extent, developing countries may have the advantage in not having developed so much dependency on a fully reliable electrical grid and have more distributed generating capability. But no, I don't think there's a lot of sharing or help going on there at all. And it's something that we really need to look at as far as CMEs are concerned. Now, I don't think developing countries are as likely to suffer an EMP attack, right? Nobody's going to come after them with a nuclear weapon, probably. So they also have that advantage. But if you're talking about a natural event, it's a problem. And then I think there's the question of if there was a CME event and one half of the world took it really hard, depending on which way the planet happens to be facing at the time, would the aggressor state on the other side choose to use that moment to launch an attack that might be devastating?
Yeah, just briefly, when we talk about developing countries, there are pluses and minuses. Certainly the fact that they have economies that are designed to be less dependent on infrastructure helps. The reality, though, is that if there were an extreme event that occurred to a first world country, in this case we're talking about EMP, the developing countries are the much more sensitive, as I think we've seen exhibited many times, to shocks to the global economy. So if there were to be an EMP attack or another severe attack that created tremendous disruption in the developing world, the impact on, tremendous disruption in the developed world, the impact on the developing world would be extreme. Let me add, on the renewable front, we're all developing countries. We're repowering Earth, and the inverters that we have designed, the load following and load forming inverters, have not been optimized for all the things they need to do, including substituting speed for inertia on the system. Not to mention, there's a lot of power electronics and electronics. Another plug for Dominion here, since Matt is one of the leaders in the U.S. at least. They have been using shielded control cable, number 12, number 9, copper cables out to the breakers and control for many, many years. Much of the industry has not. So the ability to protect the relays, and the developing countries are much better off because, I won't mention the name, everybody will know what I'm talking about that's buying them. These relays that are in blue boxes have been shielded for about 5 years now. And we know that we know how to shield the relay themselves. It's the entrance cable and the holes that we were talking about that we can't necessarily, the antennas that we have out into the control world, that's an issue. With that, I think we're winding down. Chris, turn it over to our fearless leader. Which fearless leader wants the ball first? I want Avi to wind it down. So.
Thank you very much, Terry. As things have actually grown from where we were this morning, so it was like many years ago now when the projector wasn't working. But I think we are now in a much better place. And the good news is that we will continue in this room tomorrow. So mine is just to say thank you ever so much. I've learned a lot, not just about the threat space, threat vectors, the threat landscape, the interconnectivity of everything else. We've talked about the entire planet, from the developed world, the developing world, and in some instances, as was correctly said, we're all developing. So I think the message, at least that I've received today, is that we are obviously being faced by some potentially existential threats, but we should, as a collective, be equal to it in terms of doing something about it. So I think it would be useful tomorrow, and certainly for Wednesday morning, to come up with some tangible actions as the global community, starting with us here, to be able to begin to address this serious threat, not just to the planet, but where the planet sits within the galaxy. Imperial College London, as a top 10 science, innovation, business, and medical university, is willing to walk the walk with all of you, all the stakeholders, to address this particular problem. So we're very proud to have you. Please turn up. I know it's a long day. There'll be a relatively long one tomorrow, but we will have also an optional tour of our civil and environmental engineering department, so that you're able to see some of the facilities that we have, and also maybe get to meet some of our colleagues along the corridors just across the road. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to the team at Imperial, the team at EIS, and most importantly, the delegates here and online. And have a great evening until tomorrow morning. So thank you very much indeed. And thanks for listening.
I thought we are staying here until tomorrow.
That's true. Can you look at it? Yeah.